It was a routine day in the cardiac intensive care unit, a place where every breath, every heartbeat is precious, especially for the most fragile patients. But for 8-month-old baby X, recovering from life-saving heart surgery, that day would turn tragic. A simple yet devastating mistake was made. A dose of calcium chloride meant to stabilize his heart was administered in a lethal amount, 10 times the prescribed dose. The nurse who made that mistake? Kimberly Hiatt, 25 years of experience, a spotless record, and known for her compassionate care. But in the blink of an eye, her entire world would collapse. How could such an experienced nurse make a mistake this big? Was it simply human error, or was there something deeper at play? And more importantly, what would this fatal error mean, not just for baby X, but for the woman who had dedicated her life to saving others? In this video, we unravel the story of one fatal misstep, the ripple effect it caused, and the haunting question of whether it all could have been prevented. Now, before we continue, I'd like to ask you a small favor. Our channel is still new, and every single subscriber helps us grow. Your support motivates us to produce even more in-depth, high-quality content like this. So if you're enjoying these deep dives into medical mishaps and want to stay updated on future videos, please consider subscribing. It's a simple action that would mean the world to us and ensures you never miss out on any new cases. Now, without further ado, let's get back to the case. Kimberly Hiatt wasn't just any nurse. She was a figure of compassion and dedication, a true caregiver. Her journey into nursing began years before she ever set foot in the hospital. Growing up in a small, tight-knit community, Hiatt had always been the kind of person who would help anyone in need. Whether it was tending to an injured animal or helping an elderly neighbor, she had an innate desire to heal. But it wasn't until she entered nursing school that her true calling became clear. Hiatt excelled in her studies, particularly in pediatrics and neonatal care. Friends described her as laser-focused, someone who was meticulous in everything she did. No detail was too small, no task too insignificant. She had found her place in the world. After graduating, Hiatt quickly made a name for herself. In 1985, she began her long career at Seattle Children's Hospital. For 25 years, she served in one of the most intense areas of healthcare, the Cardiac Intensive Care Unit, CICU, where infants and newborns with life-threatening conditions came to fight for their lives. In this pressure cooker of high stakes and fragile patients, Hiatt thrived. Colleagues often called her the backbone of the unit, someone you could rely on no matter the circumstances. She was the one who always remained calm, even when lives were hanging by a thread. But as Hiatt would soon find out, even the best can falter. On September 14, 2010, Kimberly Hiatt walked into the CICU, unaware that this day would forever change her life. She had been assigned to care for an 8-month-old baby, whom we will call Baby X, to protect the family's privacy. Baby X had been born with a congenital heart defect, known as tetralogy of Fallot, TOF. This condition, a complex malformation of the heart, meant that Baby X's life had been precarious from the moment he took his first breath. For months, this little boy had fought bravely through surgeries and treatments. His first surgery, a Blalock-Taussig shunt procedure, had been performed shortly after birth. The shunt was meant to increase blood flow to the lungs, buying time until a more permanent repair could be made. But this was just the beginning. The ultimate goal was a more complete repair of Baby X's heart, a delicate and complicated surgery that would involve closing a hole between the chambers of his heart and relieving the obstruction that was preventing blood from flowing properly to his lungs. This procedure took hours, with every stitch, every adjustment, a matter of life and death. By September, Baby X had undergone his second surgery, a critical operation that had left his heart fragile and his life hanging in the balance. he was transferred to the CICU for post-operative care, where nurses like Hiatt were responsible for monitoring his delicate recovery. The atmosphere in the CICU was always tense, but this case carried extra weight. Every medication, every vital sign, every slight fluctuation in the baby's condition had to be meticulously monitored. Hiatt, with her years of experience, understood the gravity of the situation. Baby X was ordered a precise amount of calcium chloride, GAO, a vital medication needed to stabilize his heart function. This wasn't just any routine treatment. Calcium plays an essential role in heart muscle contraction, and for a baby recovering from heart surgery, the dosage had to be exact. But then, in the blink of an eye, it all went terribly wrong. Hiatt, confident in her abilities, prepared to administer the calcium chloride, a task she had done countless times before. The prescription called for 140 milligrams. But something happened in that moment. Whether it was a distraction, a mental slip, or just a cruel trick of fate, she drew up 1.4 grams of the medication, a tenfold overdose. The difference between 140 milligrams and 1.4 grams, a simple decimal point. But in the world of medicine, that tiny error can mean the difference between life and death. Without hesitation, Hiatt administered the medication, and within moments, the realization hit her. It must have felt like an icy chill running down her spine as she uttered the words no nurse ever wants to say. "Oh my God, I gave too much calcium." The room fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. Immediately, Hiatt alerted her team, her heart pounding as she watched her colleagues scramble into action. They worked to mitigate the effects of the overdose, administering calcium gluconate in an attempt to lower the dangerously high calcium levels in baby X's blood. The minutes dragged on as doctors and nurses worked frantically to stabilize the baby. Excessive calcium in the bloodstream can cause arrhythmias, irregular heartbeats that can spiral into cardiac arrest. Baby X, already fragile, was now facing an even greater battle. His heart, struggling to pump blood after the surgery, was now being pushed to its limits. Hiatt could do nothing but watch. The moment she realized her error, her life had changed forever. The baby's monitors beeped ominously as the medical team fought to keep him alive. The hours that followed were critical. Baby X's heart rate began to fluctuate wildly. First, his heart started to slow down. Bradycardia, a dangerously slow rhythm. Then it would race again, struggling to keep pace with the damage being done inside his body. The team adjusted his medications, increased his oxygen levels, and worked tirelessly to keep him stable. Time was now the enemy. By the end of that day, the baby's condition was still precarious. He was placed on life support, and every medical decision was aimed at buying him more time, another hour, another day. But by the next morning, baby X's condition had worsened. His organs were beginning to shut down. Over the course of the next few days, the situation grew more desperate. Despite their best efforts, the damage from the calcium overdose, coupled with his already delicate condition, proved too much to overcome. Then came the heartbreaking news. On September 19, 2010, 5 days after the overdose, baby X passed away. The medical team was devastated. Hiatt's colleagues were in shock, and for Kimberly Hiatt, the weight of that single error began to consume her. In the immediate aftermath of the incident, Seattle Children's Hospital quickly initiated an internal review to understand what had gone so terribly wrong. Was this a singular error, an unfortunate mistake in an otherwise flawless system, or could it be a symptom of something deeper, a systemic issue lurking beneath the surface? These were the questions being asked, and while the hospital sought answers, Kimberly Hiatt's world had already started to unravel. Hiatt was swiftly placed on administrative leave as the investigation unfolded. For someone who had spent 25 years in the same hospital, the shock of being removed from the very environment she had dedicated her life to must have been profound. Imagine, after decades of service, being sidelined, not knowing what the outcome would be, left to sit with the crushing weight of your own mistake. While the hospital focused on investigating the overdose, the infant's family was facing an unspeakable loss, the death of their child. For them, it was a heartbreaking tragedy that no investigation could undo. Meanwhile, Hiatt, whose career up until that day had been spotless, was now grappling with the collapse of everything she had built. Could she have ever predicted that after 25 years without a major error, her career would end so abruptly? But end it did. Just weeks after the incident, the hospital administration delivered its final blow: termination. For Hiatt, this wasn't just the loss of a job, it was the loss of her identity, her purpose, and the close-knit support system she had spent decades building within the CICU. How do you move forward when everything you've known comes crashing down in an instant? The decision to fire Hiatt, despite her immediate admission of the mistake and her otherwise untarnished history, sparked fierce debate. Many of her colleagues were left in shock, believing that her punishment far outweighed the error she had committed. Nurses working in critical care units operate under immense pressure daily, with the stakes always sky high. Could the hospital have handled this differently? Was firing her truly the right course of action? Or was it simply an act of institutional self-preservation? Without the support of her hospital, and with her career in ruins, the emotional toll on Hiatt only grew heavier. She was no longer the competent, capable nurse everyone once knew, at least not in her own eyes. Isolated and devastated, she faced the tragedy alone. Losing her job at Seattle Children's Hospital was only the beginning of Kimberly Hiatt's ordeal. The Washington State Nursing Care Quality Assurance Commission quickly launched their own investigation into the medication error. They wanted to know exactly what had gone wrong and whether Hiatt's actions were negligent or amounted to a breach of professional conduct. This wasn't just about losing a job. This was about Hiatt's entire professional standing. Everything she had worked for was on the line. For the commission, the investigation wasn't just about assigning blame. It was about determining if this tragic mistake reflected a deeper flaw in Hiatt's approach to patient care. Was this a one-off error, or had Hiatt been cutting corners throughout her career? After a detailed and exhaustive review of her 25 years in nursing, the board came to a conclusion. Yes, she had made a serious mistake. But this wasn't part of a pattern, nor was it a result of negligence. It was a single error in a long, otherwise spotless career. But the consequences could not be ignored. The board had to impose penalties in light of the infant's death. Hiatt was fined $3,000 and placed on probation for 4 long years. The terms of this probation weren't easy either. She was required to complete 80 hours of coursework on medication administration. These were not just academic lessons, but a constant reminder of the mistake that had taken everything from her. Furthermore, her compliance with the terms was to be monitored, with her supervisor regularly reporting to the board on her progress. It was as if her entire career was under a magnifying glass. But while these measures were meant to rehabilitate Hiatt and allow her to continue practicing nursing, the damage was already done. The combination of losing her job, being publicly scrutinized, and now facing the board's penalties weighed on her like an unbearable burden. Public opinion wasn't kind, and Hiatt found herself trapped in a cycle of shame and guilt. How do you rebuild a career when the world only remembers your worst day? Even though the board recognized that Hiatt's mistake wasn't due to negligence, the fatal outcome of the incident meant she could never truly escape the consequences. Her identity as a skilled, trusted nurse had been shattered, and with it, the sense of purpose that had driven her through decades of caring for others. Struggling under the weight of it all, Hiatt couldn't seem to find a way forward. Kimberly Hiatt's emotional unraveling after the incident became a tragic case study of what is now known as second victim syndrome, a term used to describe the emotional trauma healthcare professionals experience after being involved in a medical error. While the first victims are the patients and their families, the second victims are the caregivers, who often carry the weight of guilt, shame, and isolation. And for Kimberly Hiatt, that weight was crushing. Despite the fact that her mistake was entirely unintentional, the burden of knowing that her actions contributed to the death of a child became something she couldn't shake. How do you live with that knowledge? For Hiatt, it became an almost unbearable reality. Her family and friends later recalled how the institutional response to the incident, the firing, the scrutiny, the coldness, only made things worse. It wasn't just the mistake itself that weighed on Hiatt, but the harshness of how she was treated afterward. She had always been the one helping others, but now, in her moment of greatest need, there was no one to help her. It was as if the support system she had spent decades building had vanished in an instant. Hiatt began to withdraw from those around her. What had once been a promising and fulfilling career now felt like a constant reminder of failure. The public criticism, the feeling of being punished and discarded, led to an overwhelming sense of worthlessness. As her mental health deteriorated, she battled severe depression, sinking deeper into a darkness she couldn't escape. And this is where a second victim syndrome becomes so devastating. Many healthcare professionals find themselves in similar situations. They make a mistake, one they may never have made in decades of practice, and suddenly their entire identity is questioned. But in Hiatt's case, the situation was magnified by the lack of institutional support. Hospitals and regulatory bodies are often quick to discipline professionals for errors. But where are the mental health services? Where is the emotional support when it's needed the most? Hiatt's case became a tragic example of the emotional toll medical mistakes take, not just on the patients and their families, but on the professionals who dedicate their lives to saving others. In the aftermath of her mistake, Hiatt felt more than just guilt. She felt abandoned. And without the right support, her emotional wounds only deepened, eventually leading her down a path from which there was no return. By April 2011, the weight of Kimberly Hiatt's emotional and psychological suffering had reached an unbearable tipping point. After more than 2 decades dedicated to patient care, her life had been shattered by a single mistake. But was it just the error itself that broke her, or the cascade of consequences that followed? The overdose, the swift termination, and the relentless investigation by the state nursing board had left her with nowhere to turn. For someone who had built her entire identity around being a caregiver, losing her job meant far more than the loss of employment. It was the loss of her very sense of self. She wasn't just a nurse. She was a healer, a protector of life. And now, she felt she had failed at the one thing that defined her. By the time April 2011 arrived, Hiatt's world had grown small and suffocating. The mounting public scrutiny, the internal guilt, and the isolation she faced became too much. When someone's sense of purpose is stripped away, how do they find their way back? For Hiatt, tragically, she couldn't. On April 3, 2011, Kimberly Hiatt took her own life in her home, marking the final and most devastating chapter of this tragic story. The news of her death sent shockwaves through her family, friends, and colleagues. It wasn't just the loss of a life. It was the culmination of a series of events that led to an inevitable, heartbreaking conclusion. Those who knew her were left asking a painful question. Could this have been prevented? Had Hiatt received the emotional and psychological support she so desperately needed, would she still be here today? For Kimberly, it wasn't a matter of shirking responsibility. She had owned up to her mistake from the very beginning. But the system around her, instead of offering a hand of compassion or a path toward healing, had isolated her. The institutions she had trusted turned their backs on her when she needed them most. The crushing combination of personal guilt and institutional abandonment proved too much for her to bear. Hiatt's suicide drew national attention to an issue that had been largely overlooked until then. How are healthcare professionals treated after they make mistakes? More specifically, how are nurses, often the unsung heroes in hospitals, supported when they find themselves at the center of a tragic medical error? Her death became a focal point for discussions surrounding second victim syndrome, a term that captures the emotional and psychological trauma experienced by healthcare providers after committing errors that harm patients. Hiatt was a second victim, collateral damage in a system that is quick to punish, but slow to offer the support needed to heal from such traumatic events. In the wake of her death, those closest to her reflected on the harsh realities she had faced. Her family and friends remembered a kind, dedicated nurse whose guilt had been amplified by the lack of empathy from the very institutions she had served. Instead of counseling, Hiatt was met with punishment. Instead of compassion, she was met with isolation. And instead of healing, she was left to battle her demons alone. Kimberly Hiatt's death serves as a sobering reminder of the importance of institutional empathy. When healthcare professionals make mistakes, the focus shouldn't only be on what went wrong, but on how to help those who are emotionally and mentally impacted by the error. But it leaves us wondering, could the second tragedy, Kimberly's untimely death, have been prevented if she had received the support she so desperately needed? Was this case an isolated mistake, or does it expose a broader issue in how healthcare systems handle human error? And what about second victim syndrome? Should hospitals be doing more to protect the mental health of the very people who dedicate their lives to saving others? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think Kimberly's death could have been avoided? Should healthcare institutions rethink their response to medical errors? Let us know in the comments. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to hit the like button, share this video with others, and subscribe for more deep dives into real-life tragedies and the impact they have on all those involved.